In 1995, a jury in the state of Idaho handed down a verdict that should have been impossible. A single tool truck distributor, one man, one route, one van stocked with wrenches and ratchets, had just been awarded $500,000 in compensatory damages against one of the largest tool companies in North America. The Idaho Supreme Court didn't mince its language. The conduct of Mack Tools, a division of the Stanley Works, had been, in the court's own words, wanton, malicious, and outrageous. That same year, the attorney who had represented the Idaho distributor settled more than 50 similar claims against Mack Tools across the United States. Total value, over $1.8 million. 50 families, 50 routes, 50 men and women who had invested their savings, their trucks, their years into a system that had decided they were expendable. Here's what makes that number extraordinary. Mack Tools wasn't failing. The brand was still on the road. The vans were still rolling. Mechanics across America still recognized the logo, still bought the sockets, still put the tools on credit from the man who showed up every Tuesday morning. The company hadn't gone bankrupt. It hadn't been shuttered. It hadn't been exported to Taiwan or dissolved in a leveraged buyout. It had simply decided that the people who built its reputation, route by route, handshake by handshake over 4 decades, were a liability instead of an asset. But the real story of Mack Tools is not the lawsuits, and it is not the verdicts. It is the story of 7 men in a dying Ohio town who had less than $5,000 between them, a garage the size of a double living room, and an idea about how to sell a wrench that would reshape an entire industry. It is the story of what they built, why it worked, what it meant to the mechanics who depended on it, and what happened when a corporation 150 years old acquired something it could measure in dollars but never fully understand. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories behind the machines, the tools, and the companies that built the physical world. If that's the kind of history you want more of, give the video a like and subscribe. We cover the brands that made American manufacturing what it is and what it was. The story begins in Sabina, Ohio, 1938. Sabina, Ohio is not a place that appears on many maps. In 1938, it was a town of roughly 2,700 people, set in the flat farmland of Clinton County, halfway between Columbus and Cincinnati. There were no major railroads running through it, no large factories, no particular reason for anyone outside the county to know its name. What Sabina had was what most small Ohio towns had in the late 1930s, a few machine shops, a grain elevator, a hardware store, and men who knew how to work with their hands because there had never been any other option. It was also the 9th year of the Great Depression. Banks had failed across the country. Unemployment had peaked at nearly 25% earlier in the decade and had never fully recovered. Men who had spent their entire working lives in a single trade found themselves with no employer, no savings, and no obvious path forward. In that environment, starting a manufacturing company from scratch was not ambition. It was closer to stubbornness. Ralph McPherson knew the tool business the way a man knows it when he has worked inside it for years. He had been employed at the McPherson Huff Tool Company, a small hand tool manufacturer operating out of Sabina, a company that shared his own family name, suggesting roots that ran deeper than a single job. He understood the craft, how steel behaved under a power hammer, how a combination wrench needed to be proportioned to hold torque without flexing, what separated a tool that lasted from one that didn't. He also understood the market, or at least his corner of it, and by the summer of 1938, he had decided that what he understood was worth more than a paycheck. Otto Tucker was the other half of the equation. Tucker would later serve as the company's secretary and, by all accounts, as the practical conscience of the operation, the man who kept the books, filed the paperwork, and remembered where everything came from. In September 1967, at the age of 79, Tucker sat down with a reporter from the Wilmington News-Journal on the occasion of his retirement and told the story from the beginning. His recollections are the closest thing to a primary source the early history of Mack Tools has. He remembered the founding with the kind of precision that belongs to people who lived it in close quarters. He and McPherson, he said, had decided it was now or never. On July 11, 1938, they and 5 other men signed the Articles of Incorporation in Ohio and formally established the Mechanics Tool and Forge Company. The state issued 250 shares of no par common stock. The 7 founders could only afford to subscribe to 55 of them. Between McPherson and Tucker, the 2 most visible leaders of the group, they scraped together $5,000, enough to secure a building and purchase used machinery to begin production. The workspace Tucker described was a garage measuring 50 by 60 feet. In that room, he recalled, the 2 of them worked alone at the beginning, hammering out sets of 5 combination wrenches by hand. $5,000, 55 shares, a garage smaller than most modern auto repair bays. That was the entire material foundation of what would become, 4 decades later, one of the 3 dominant professional tool brands in the United States. The craft they were practicing had a specific name. Hand forging is a process by which steel is shaped by repeated blows of a power hammer under relatively low heat, low compared to casting, where metal is poured into a mold in liquid form. The distinction matters. Forged steel develops a tighter, more continuous grain structure than cast metal. The molecules are compressed and aligned rather than randomly arranged as they cool. A forged wrench is denser, more resistant to the kind of stress fracture that occurs when a mechanic leans his full weight into a fastener that doesn't want to move. In a professional shop, where a broken tool at the wrong moment means a stalled job and a lost customer, that difference is not academic. It is the difference between a tool a mechanic trusts and one he doesn't. Then, on January 4, 1940, something happened that changed the trajectory of mechanics tool and forge entirely. The McPherson Huff Tool Company, the same operation where Ralph McPherson had worked, the company that shared his name and sat in the same small town, suffered a devastating fire. The factory was gutted. McPherson Huff was forced to suspend operations while the building was rebuilt. In the aftermath, Mechanics Tool and Forge moved quickly. They purchased McPherson Huff's damaged but salvageable inventory, cleaned the tools, retempered the steel, and brought them to market under a combined label, Mac Huff. The name stuck to the product. Then it contracted. Then it became simply Mac, and Mechanics Tool and Forge had a brand identity it had not planned but would spend the next 40 years making synonymous with quality. What came with the inventory was arguably more valuable than the tools themselves. Approximately 20 to 21 salesmen who had been working McPherson Huff's routes found themselves without an employer. They moved to Mechanics Tool and Forge. With them came something that no amount of capital could have purchased outright, an established network of customer relationships, a proven method of selling directly to mechanics at their place of work, and a workforce that already knew how to do it. The direct sales model, taking the tools to the mechanic rather than waiting for the mechanic to come to a store, was not invented by Mac. Snap-on had been running tool trucks since 1920, but the professional tool market in 1940 was not a closed competition. America was in the early stages of an automobile ownership explosion that would accelerate dramatically after the war. Every new car on the road was a future maintenance problem. Every new repair shop was a future customer. The country was large, the roads were long, and no single company could cover all of it. 7 men in Sabina had 20 salesmen, a proven product, and a name that had fallen into their laps from a fire across town. They were going to need all of it. The first years were not spectacular. They were something more durable than spectacular. They were consistent. Mechanics Tool and Forge did not arrive on the American tool market with a revolutionary patent or a single product that changed everything overnight. What they brought was simpler and, in the long run, more defensible. Reliable tools, sold by people who showed up, week after week, route after route, the same face at the same garage door, carrying the same quality of product, extending credit when a mechanic needed it, and honoring the warranty when something went wrong. In an industry where trust was the actual product being sold, consistency was the competitive advantage. And in the early 1940s, something happened that transformed that consistency into a permanent foundation. In 1942, the United States government came looking for tools. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had converted the American economy almost overnight. Factories that made consumer goods were retooled for military production. Supply chains were reorganized around the needs of the Army and Navy, and the military needed hand tools, enormous quantities of them, for field maintenance, for armored vehicle repair, for the men who kept aircraft engines running in the Pacific and truck convoys moving across North Africa. Mechanics Tool and Forge received a sizable government contract that year, and the effect was immediate. Revenue that the 7 founders had been building carefully, sale by sale, across civilian repair shops suddenly scaled in a way that no retail channel could have produced. To understand what that contract meant in practical terms, consider the stakes it carried. A field maintenance crew servicing Sherman tanks in a forward position did not have the option of ordering replacement tools from a catalog. What they carried in their kit was what they had. If a wrench failed, if the steel cracked under the torque required to loosen a seized track bolt in freezing mud, the tank stayed broken. A broken tank in a forward position was not a maintenance problem. It was a tactical problem. The tools Max supplied to the military were not accessories. They were part of the operational chain that kept men alive. The contract solidified Mechanics Tool and Forge's position in a way that peacetime growth never could have. It proved the product at scale, under conditions of genuine stress for the most demanding customer in the world, and it generated the capital that made the next phase possible. In 1944, the company recapitalized with the assistance of the Securities Commission, restructuring its financial base to support expansion. That same year, a man named Clem Poole approached the company with a proposal. Poole saw that Mac's product line had a gap: sockets and drive tools. Socket wrenches, the tools that fit over a fastener head and accept a ratchet handle to turn it, had become essential in professional shops. Mac was selling combination wrenches and screwdrivers and punches and chisels. But a mechanic building out a complete professional kit needed sockets, and Mac couldn't provide them in-house. The founders recognized the gap immediately. They didn't have the capital to close it on their own. The recapitalization had consumed their available resources. So they did something that revealed the pragmatic intelligence at the heart of how this company operated. On October 30th, 1944, a second company was incorporated, the Clinton Tool Company, established specifically to manufacture sockets and drive tools to fill out the Mac product line. It was not a merger, it was a deliberate architectural decision. Build a separate entity to do the one thing the parent company cannot yet do: keep the brands coordinated and expand the line without overextending the core operation. Then, in 1945, a third company entered the structure. Mac Allied Tools was founded in Akron, Ohio, to handle the distribution and jobbing of any part of the Mac line not manufactured in Sabina. 3 companies, one coordinated system, one brand identity reaching the customer. Mechanics Tool and Forge as the manufacturing core, Clinton Tool for sockets and drive tools, Mac Allied as the distribution arm extending beyond what Sabina could produce alone. Otto Tucker left his mark on the product line in a way that went beyond management. In June 1948, Mechanics Tool and Forge was awarded a patent for a screwdriver handle, the patent registered in Tucker's own name. A co-founder who ran the books and filed the paperwork had also designed a better grip for the most common hand tool in any shop. The patent is still in the USPTO records. It is a small detail, but it says something about the kind of people who built this company. They were not executives overseeing production from a distance. They were still close enough to the tools to improve them. By the late 1940s, the structure of what Mac was and how it worked had crystallized into something that competitors would spend years trying to replicate and never fully match. The product itself, forged steel combination wrenches, screwdrivers, punches, chisels, and now a growing socket line, was good. Not the only good product on the market, but consistently good, consistently available, and consistently backed by a warranty that the man selling it would personally honor. The price point was positioned for the professional mechanic, not cheap enough to suggest low quality, not so expensive that a working tradesman had to think twice about a single purchase. But the mechanism that made all of it work, the element that created a relationship with the market no catalog company and no hardware store chain could replicate, was the root system. A Mac distributor owned his territory, not leased it, not managed it on behalf of a corporate employer, owned it in the sense that the customer relationships on that route were his to build and his to keep. He loaded his truck on Monday morning with product he had purchased from the company at wholesale and drove to the same shops he had visited the week before. He knew which mechanic was saving up for a 3/8 drive socket set. He knew which shop owner had just landed a contract with the local fleet company and would need to upgrade his inventory. He extended credit personally, carried the receivables, and collected payment on his next visit. The transaction was not between a mechanic and a corporation. It was between 2 men who saw each other every week. That relationship was the moat, not a patent, not a proprietary material, not a manufacturing process that competitors couldn't access. The moat was trust, accumulated in increments too small to measure and too numerous to count, across thousands of routes, over decades. It could not be acquired. It could not be reverse engineered. It could only be built the same way Mac had built it, one handshake, one route, 1 week at a time. No competitor could cross it, not by price, not by product alone, not quickly. What no one in Sabina could have anticipated in 1948 was that the greatest threat to that moat would not come from outside the company at all. The post-war American economy did not rise gradually, it accelerated. Between 1945 and 1955, automobile registrations in the United States nearly doubled. Returning veterans bought cars, suburban development pushed families farther from city centers and made personal transportation a necessity rather than a luxury. New highways connected cities that had previously been a day's journey apart. And every one of those cars, millions of them, rolling off assembly lines in Detroit and into driveways across the country, would eventually need a mechanic. Independent repair shops opened in every town with a main street. Dealership service departments expanded. Fleet maintenance operations grew alongside the trucking industry, which was itself exploding as interstate commerce shifted from rail to road. America was becoming a nation that ran on internal combustion engines, and the men who kept those engines running needed tools. Not consumer-grade tools from a hardware store shelf. Professional tools, forge tools, tools that could be used 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for years without failing. Mac Tools was positioned for exactly this moment. The route system that McPherson and Tucker had assembled from the ashes of a competitor's fire in 1940 was now a mature distribution network. The product line had expanded through the Clinton tool socket division to cover nearly everything a professional mechanic required. And the men driving Mac trucks had been building customer relationships long enough that loyalty to the brand had become, in many shops, simply the way things were done. The sales force grew steadily through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Routes that had been single-man operations began generating enough volume to support assistants and eventually split into multiple territories. New distributors were recruited, trained, and put on the road. The company's physical footprint expanded beyond Sabina as the logistics of supplying a national sales force required warehousing closer to the territories being served. By the early 1960s, the three-company architecture that had served Mac through its founding decade had served its purpose. The Clinton Tool Company, which had been established in 1944 specifically to manufacture sockets, had been absorbed into the parent operation. The manufacturing and product development functions were consolidated. And in 1963, Mechanics Tool and Forge officially changed its name to Mac Tools Incorporated, retiring the founding name and replacing it with the brand identity that every mechanic on every route already knew. The name change was not merely administrative. It was an acknowledgement of a reality that had been true for years. The company was no longer defined by what it made in Sabina. It was defined by what it delivered: product, service, trust, to the men and women working in repair shops from Maine to California. Mac Allied Tools, the Akron-based distribution and jobbing arm, remained a separate entity with its own management through this period. The relationship between Mac Tools and Mac Allied was a partnership rather than a hierarchy, coordinated enough to present a unified product line to the market, independent enough that each company retained its own operational identity. It was an arrangement that worked as long as the interests of both parties remained aligned. That alignment would hold for another 15 years. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, Mac Tools competed directly with Snap-on for the professional mechanic market, and competed seriously. Snap-on had a longer history and a larger sales force. In October 1986, Forbes would estimate that Snap-on held approximately 49% of the professional tool market, with all of its competitors combined accounting for the other half. Mac was the largest of those competitors. That is not second place in a minor league. That is second place in one of the most relationship-dependent, brand-loyal markets in American commerce. The distributors who drove Mac trucks during this period were, in many cases, building something that looked like a small business dynasty. A route that a man had developed over 10 years, learning the names of every mechanic, extending credit through slow months, showing up without fail through snow and heat and every condition in between, had genuine economic value. The customer relationships on a well-maintained route represented years of accumulated goodwill that translated directly into predictable weekly revenue. Some distributors passed their routes to their sons. Others sold them to incoming distributors at prices that reflected the value of what had been built. The route was not just a job. It was an asset. This is the detail that matters most for understanding what comes later. The men and women who built Mac's market presence were not employees. They were investors, in their trucks, in their inventory, in their territories, and in the brand itself. Every week they showed up, they were making a bet that Mac Tools would honor the implicit contract at the center of the relationship. You build the route, we provide the product and the brand, and the value you create belongs to you. For 40 years, that contract held. The peak of Mac's independent era came in the years immediately before 1980. The product line had expanded well beyond the combination wrenches and screwdrivers of the founding years, to include a comprehensive range of sockets, ratchets, torque wrenches, air tools, and specialty automotive tools. The route system covered virtually every significant metropolitan and regional market in the United States and had expanded into Canada. The brand had the kind of recognition in professional shops that advertising alone cannot buy. The recognition that comes from a man walking through the door every week for 15 years and never once letting a customer down. By some estimates, Mac had grown as large as its existing ownership structure could sustain. The company needed capital for the next phase of growth, investment in manufacturing, product development, and the expansion of a distribution network that was increasingly expensive to operate as fuel costs rose and the logistics of a national sales force grew more complex. In 1979, Mac Allied Tools made a decision that, in retrospect, looks like a warning no one fully read. Mac Allied severed its relationship with Mac Tools, Incorporated. The Akron-based partner, the company that had operated alongside Mac since 1945, sharing a brand identity and a distribution philosophy, quietly reformed itself under a new name. They called it Matco Tool Corporation. The split was clean on paper. The two companies divided the product lines, separated the distribution territories, and went their own ways. Mac Allied's management had apparently determined that the future it wanted was not the future Mac Tools was about to enter. 1 year later, in 1980, the Stanley Works arrived with a purchase offer. Stanley was not a stranger to the tool business. Founded in New Britain, Connecticut in 1843, it was one of the oldest hardware manufacturers in American history. A company that had survived the Civil War, 2 World Wars, and the full arc of American industrialization. Its product line covered hand tools, hardware, and building products sold through retail channels across the country. It was, by any measure, a serious company with serious resources. What Stanley was not, in 1980, was a company built around the professional mechanic. Its distribution model was retail. Its customer relationships were with hardware chains and home improvement stores. Its understanding of the market was built on volume and shelf placement, the logic of mass distribution, not the logic of a man in a truck who knows every customer by name. The acquisition made sense on a spreadsheet. Mac Tools had revenue, market share, a recognizable brand, and a national distribution network. Stanley had capital, manufacturing infrastructure, and the scale to invest in the next phase of growth. On paper, the combination addressed the weaknesses of both companies. But there is a category of value that does not appear on a balance sheet. It cannot be audited. It cannot be transferred in a transaction. It lives in the specific human relationships between a distributor and his customers, in the trust built over years of showing up, in the understanding, unwritten, unenforceable, but real, that the company standing behind the brand understood why those relationships mattered. Stanley Works understood the tools. What it would take another decade to reveal was how little it understood the people who sold them. For the first decade, the acquisition looked like it might work. Stanley ran Mac Tools as a relatively autonomous division through most of the 1980s. The route system continued operating along the lines it had followed for 40 years. Distributors drove their territories, built their customer bases, and operated under the same basic understanding that had defined the Mac relationship since the beginning. You invest in the route, you own what you build. The product line expanded. In 1984, Stanley acquired Proto Tools from Ingersoll Rand, adding another professional tool brand to its portfolio and signaling that it intended to compete seriously in the mechanics market. Mac's sales force continued to grow. New territories were opened. By the mid-1980s, Mac was visible enough that Forbes was naming it specifically as one of the handful of competitors capable of challenging Snap-on's market dominance. From the outside, Mac Tools under Stanley looked like a company moving forward. The pressure that would eventually destroy that appearance was building quietly in the background, in the way that structural pressure always builds, invisibly, incrementally, until the moment it isn't invisible anymore. Stanley Works was a publicly traded company. It answered to shareholders on a quarterly basis. Its executives were evaluated on metrics that measured financial performance in intervals of 90 days. The professional tool division, Mac Tools, was one line among many in a portfolio that also included consumer hardware, building products, and a growing security business. When Mac performed well, it contributed to the portfolio. When the portfolio needed to perform better, Mac was expected to contribute more. This is the logic of conglomerate ownership, and it is not inherently corrupt. But it is structurally incompatible with a business model built on long-term relationship investment. A distributor who spends 3 years developing a territory before it becomes consistently profitable is making a rational investment if the time horizon is a decade. He is making an irrational one if the time horizon is a fiscal quarter. Stanley and its Mac distributors were, without anyone fully acknowledging it, operating on different clocks. Then the recession arrived. The early 1990s brought an economic contraction that compressed margins across virtually every sector of American manufacturing. Profits at large conglomerates fell, boards demanded restructuring, and at Stanley Works, the word came down that Mac Tools, the division that had been operating with relative independence for a decade, was going to change. The restructuring that followed was not announced as a betrayal. It was announced as modernization. The language was the language of efficiency, streamlined operations, optimized distribution, improved margins. What it meant in practice was the systematic replacement of the independent distributor model with a structure that generated more revenue for the parent company and less security for the people on the road. The specific mechanism varied by market and by region, but the pattern was consistent. Distributors who had operated their routes for years, in some cases for more than a decade, found their agreements altered, their territories redrawn, or their contracts terminated. The compensation structures that had made the route a viable small business investment were revised in ways that shifted risk downward and profit upward. Men who had borrowed money to buy their trucks, stocked their inventory on credit, and spent years building customer relationships discovered that the asset they believed they owned was more conditional than they had understood. What made the situation legally explosive was a specific detail buried in the structure of the Mac distributor relationship. Mac Tools had always described its distributors as independent contractors, self-employed business people who purchased product at wholesale and resold it on their own routes. The legal and practical distinction between an independent contractor and a franchisee is significant. A franchisee operates under a defined legal framework that includes specific disclosure requirements, regulated termination procedures, and enforceable protections against arbitrary cancellation. An independent contractor has none of those protections. The Federal Trade Commission's Rule 436 requires any company selling what amounts to a franchise to provide prospective buyers with a franchise disclosure document, a comprehensive summary of the business terms, financial performance data, and the names of current and former participants that a buyer can contact before committing their money. Mac Tools had not been providing that document because Mac Tools was not calling it a franchise. Distributors across the country began comparing notes, the territory requirements, the mandatory purchase minimums, the restrictions on what could be sold and how, the level of operational control Mac exercised over routes that were supposedly independently owned. Taken together, these elements met the legal definition of a franchise under both federal and multiple state statutes. The men and women who had signed on as independent distributors had, in the legal sense, purchased franchises. They had done so without the disclosures the law required. And when Mac terminated their agreements, it had done so without the procedural protections franchise law mandated. The courts began to agree. In Idaho, a distributor named Bill Griffin brought his case to the state Supreme Court. The verdict was unambiguous. The Idaho Supreme Court found that Mac Tools had engaged in conduct that was, in the court's specific language, wanton, malicious, and outrageous. language that in legal terms signals not merely negligence, but deliberate disregard for the rights of the person harmed. The court awarded Griffin $500,000 in compensatory damages. The decision established a precedent that opened the door for every other distributor in the country who believed they had been similarly treated. The attorney who had represented Griffin moved quickly. In 1995 alone, he settled more than 50 claims against Mac Tools across the United States. The total value of those settlements exceeded $1.8 million. Cases were filed or pending across North America, in multiple U.S. states and in Canada, with virtually all of them built on the same foundation. Mac had sold franchises while calling them distributorships, exercised franchise-level control while denying franchise-level protections, and terminated agreements without the legal process that franchise law required. In Canada, the situation took a slightly different shape. Stanley had considered rolling out a new distribution structure it called Mac Direct, a reorganized system that would have converted existing independent routes to a more controlled corporate model. Canadian distributors resisted, protests mounted. In August 1997, a letter went out to the entire Canadian distributor force confirming that the Mac Direct program would not be introduced in Canada. The letter stated explicitly, "There are no plans to introduce Mac Direct in Canada." The concession did not repair the damage. Distributors who had received that letter had already watched what happened to their American counterparts. The trust that had taken 40 years to build, the implicit contract between the brand and the people who carried it, had been broken in a way that a letter could not restore. Then the Federal Trade Commission arrived. In 1999, the FTC issued an order against the Stanley Works, following an investigation into claims that Mac Tools products were being marketed as made in the USA when a significant portion of their content was foreign-sourced. The specific products at issue were Mac Tools zero-degree ratchets. For a product to carry a Made in the USA label under FTC guidelines, it must be all or virtually all manufactured domestically. The ratchets did not meet that standard. Stanley signed a consent order prohibiting future misrepresentation of the domestic content of its professional-grade hand tools. 7 years later, Stanley violated that order. In 2006, the FTC filed a new complaint against the Stanley Works, documenting that Mac Tools zero-degree ratchets were again being sold with Made in the USA, claims that did not reflect the actual foreign content of the product. The civil penalty was $205,000, a significant portion of the profits generated by the mislabeled tools. The 1999 consent order was extended by an additional 20 years from the date of the new complaint. The sequence is worth holding for a moment. The same brand that had been built on personal trust, on a distributor showing up every week and standing behind every tool he sold, had been found twice, in formal federal proceedings, to have misrepresented the origin of its products to the professional mechanics those distributors were selling to. The lawsuits multiplied. A website called MacToolsSucks.com appeared, documenting distributor grievances in granular detail. Former distributors from across the country posted their accounts. Families who had invested their savings into routes that were subsequently terminated without compensation described what had happened in language that was specific, consistent, and damning. The pattern was not a series of isolated incidents. It was a system producing predictable outcomes. Cases were argued, settlements were reached quietly. New distributors were recruited to replace the ones who had left or been terminated, often without being told the full history of the routes they were buying into. The product line shrank. The brand's reputation in professional shops, not for tool quality, but for the relationship that had always surrounded the tools, began to carry a question mark it had never carried before. Mac Tools was still on the road, the trucks were still rolling, but something that had taken 40 years to build, something that no acquisition price had ever actually captured, was gone. It does not appear on any balance sheet. It never did. Mac Tools did not disappear. That is worth stating plainly, because the story of American manufacturing in the second half of the 20th century is filled with brands that simply ceased to exist, names that were auctioned off, trademarks that ended up on products made in countries their founders never visited, companies that closed their doors and left nothing behind but a logo in an archive somewhere. Mac Tools is not that story. The trucks are still on the road. The tools are still being made. The brand that 7 men incorporated in a 50 by 60-foot garage in Sabina, Ohio on July 11, 1938, is still, In 2026, a functioning commercial enterprise. But survival and continuity are not the same thing. In 2010, Stanley Works completed a merger with Black & Decker, creating Stanley Black & Decker, a conglomerate with annual revenues that would eventually reach $15.4 billion. Mac Tools became one brand among dozens in a portfolio that included DeWalt, Craftsman, Irwin, Lennox, and Proto, among others. The professional tools segment, which Mac anchors alongside Proto and other brands, reported net sales of $13.3 billion in 2024. Mac's specific contribution is not broken out in public filings. It is a line inside a conglomerate, present, profitable in some measure, and almost entirely invisible as a discrete entity. The franchise model that had caused so much damage in the 1990s was formally restructured and officially acknowledged. In 2011, Mac Tools began operating as a registered franchise system, calling the relationship what it had legally been for decades and providing prospective buyers with the franchise disclosure documents that the FTC had long required. The current network consists of approximately 1,679 distributors across the United States. The primary distribution center operates out of Hilliard, Ohio. Tools are manufactured at plants in Dallas, Texas, and Georgetown, Ohio, making Mac one of the smaller number of professional tool brands that still produces a meaningful portion of its line on American soil. The product line today runs to more than 42,000 items: ratchets, wrenches, sockets, torque tools, air tools, power tools, tool storage, shop equipment, and diagnostic electronics. It is a comprehensive catalog by any measure. What it is not, what it cannot be, structurally, as a division of a publicly traded conglomerate, is what it was when the men who drove Mac trucks owned their roots and their reputations in equal measure. In professional shops across the country, the conversation about Mac Tools has never fully resolved. Mechanics who have been in the trade long enough to remember the pre-Stanley era speak about the older tools with a specificity that is not nostalgia. They are describing a technical reality. The hand-forged combination wrenches and screwdrivers produced in Sabina during the 1940s and 1950s were manufactured to a standard that reflected the constraints of their era, not in spite of those constraints, but because of them. When the only way to shape steel is to hammer it repeatedly under heat, the resulting grain structure is not a marketing claim. It is a measurable physical property. A wrench forged in Sabina in 1952 has a molecular density that a wrench stamped from sheet steel in a modern high-volume facility does not replicate. For certain applications, particularly in restoration work, in classic vehicle maintenance, where fasteners have been in place for 60 years and may be corroded to the point where any flex in the tool risks rounding the head, the older tools are not a preference. They are the correct choice. This is why the secondary market for vintage Mac tools has never cooled. On forums like the Garage Journal and Practical Machinist, threads dedicated to mechanics tool and forge and early Mac Tools products run to hundreds of posts. Collectors and working tradespeople describe the tools in the language of metallurgy and personal history simultaneously, discussing heat treatment dates and forge marks alongside stories of the routes where the tools were originally sold, the distributors who sold them, the shops where they spent their working lives. A complete set of mechanics tool and forge combination wrenches from the 1940s, still in the original leatherette roll with the Sabina, Ohio stamp visible on each piece, commands prices on the used market that reflect something beyond mere utility. A single Doe wrench from the founding era, open-end forged marked with the MAC name and the Ohio origin, changes hands for amounts that would have seemed improbable to the men who hammered them out in that original garage. What buyers are purchasing, in part, is proof that the thing was made by people who cared how it was made. That proof is in the steel itself. The town of Sabina, Ohio has not changed much. The population in 2026 remains close to what it was in 1938, roughly 2,700 people in the flat farmland of Clinton County, halfway between Columbus and Cincinnati. There is no monument to the Mechanics Tool and Forge Company, no historical marker on the street where the original garage stood. The physical site of the founding has been absorbed back into the ordinary landscape of a small Ohio town that has seen businesses come and go across nearly a century without making much of a record of either. And then there is Otto Tucker. In September 1967, at 79 years old, Tucker sat down with a reporter from the Wilmington News Journal and remembered everything. He remembered the decision he and McPherson had made. Now or never, he called it. He remembered working alone in that garage, the two of them hammering out 5-piece combination wrench sets by hand. He remembered the fire across town and the 20 salesmen who came with the salvaged inventory. He remembered building something from nothing during the worst economic decade in American history and watching it grow into a company that employed hundreds of people and put professional tools in the hands of mechanics from one coast to the other. In June of that same year, just months before his retirement interview, the United States Patent and Trademark Office had recorded a patent for a screwdriver handle. The inventor listed was Otto Tucker, the man who had served as secretary of a 7-person startup in a Depression-era Ohio town, who had kept the books and filed the paperwork and hammered wrenches by hand in a 50 by 60-foot garage, had also designed a better tool. The patent is still in the record. Tucker retired at 79 and, by all available evidence, spent the rest of his life without knowing what the company he founded would eventually become, or what would eventually be done to the people who carried its name down every highway and back road in America. There is something in that ignorance that feels almost like mercy. What Mac Tools represents in the longer arc of American manufacturing history is a question the evidence answers but does not resolve comfortably. It is the story of a distribution model so effective that it survived 40 years of competition from a better-funded rival. It is the story of a brand built not in a factory or an advertising campaign, but in the accumulated daily decisions of thousands of individuals who chose to show up, to stand behind what they sold, and to treat a business relationship as a human one. And it is the story of what happens when the entity that acquires that brand understands its financial value precisely and its human value not at all. The tools that Ralph McPherson and Otto Tucker forged in Sabina are still out there. They are in tool chests in garages in Ohio and Idaho and everywhere in between. They are in the hands of mechanics who inherited them from fathers who bought them off a truck that came by every Tuesday. They do not announce themselves. They do not require explanation. They are simply there, unchanged, doing exactly what a group of 7 men in a dying town decided, in the worst year they could have chosen and the only year they had, that a tool should do. Pick one up, feel the weight of it, put it on a fastener and pull, it holds.